I rise to make my contribution to the 2025 National Budget Debates, a budget presented by the Honorable Senior Minister within the Office of the President with responsibility for finance, Dr. Ashni Singh. While I acknowledge that some steps have been taken to address the needs of our country, we cannot ignore the glaring discrepancies between the government's rhetoric and the reality faced by the many working class of Guyana. The government's budget may seem promising on paper with bold projections of economic growth, but when we scratch beneath the surface, we see a government out of touch with the everyday struggles of ordinary citizens of this country. The facts supported, of course, by empirical evidence of daily lives tell a different story. Mr. Speaker, earlier, my colleague, the Honorable Sarah Brown, attempted to highlight what she called, in my words, in my own interpretation, a paradise in Region 1 by this government. Mr. Speaker, I will not attempt, Madam Speaker, my apologies. I will not attempt to discredit her, but I'll ask some very pertinent questions that are asked every day by the citizens of this country. If indeed we are in such a glowing paradise, one, how come a healthcare center is without simple things like Panadol? Number two, how come, Madam Speaker, it is seemingly that one businessman is doing more than an entire government? He's doing so much that he has to be stopped. Madam Speaker, how come we can't afford to buy basic food as we may need? How come those school buses are operational as we speak in Marbruma to transport primary school children from their school to home? If these are the paradise, then it leaves much to desire. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, my apologies. You can sway 1,000 men by appealing to their prejudices quicker than you can convince one man by logic. Madam Speaker, we'll both agree that if some of our leaders spend more time or use their voices that they used to heckle, we'll have better presentations in this assembly. Madam Speaker, I'd like to touch on my own personal experiences, as my colleague did touch on her own. I recall, of course, everybody already know that I'm from Imbatero. I recall paddling a canoe from Imbatero to go to Marawana, then walk from Marawana for 90 minutes to get to the secondary school. And that's not under the APNO FC, that was under the PP government. And I know that my colleague, the Honorable Sarah Brown, is far younger than I am. And so all the description of her struggle she did mention earlier happened under the PP government. Madam Speaker, it is clear from examining the 2025 budget, which was presented under the theme, a secure, prosperous, and sustainable Guyana. If I were benefiting through large contracts from this government, from this budget, if my life was made luxurious by this government, by this budget, then of course I will come here and say the budget is an excellent one. I have no other choice. So despite the ambitious projection, it does not adequately address the most urgent need of the working class, farmers, vulnerable communities. This budget delivers more of the same promises that haven't been able to ease the suffering of the many ordinary Guyanese. We cannot morally support a budget that disregards the basic necessities of the Guyanese people in favor of large-scale infrastructure projects and foreign investments. It's time to shift our priorities and rethink an economic strategy that is realistic, doable, and above all, livable for the typical working person. Although the finance minister proudly lists growth rates, we must keep in mind that these estimates are based on exaggerated assumptions and heavily depend on the oil and gas sector. Our economic growth cannot be driven exclusively by oil income. We have seen this before. Our entire economy is at risk when output flutters and global oil prices decline. It is imperative that we concentrate on diversifying our economy by supporting small businesses, sectors, and of course, agriculture like in my region. In addition to attracting international investment, of course, we'll move forward. We require a more sustainable and well-rounded strategy for growth, one that encourages regional entrepreneurship and generates employment outside of the oil industry. In order to ensure that all areas and industries are developed, at the same time, we will advocate for increased investment in industries, including manufacturing, tourism, agriculture, and others. The working class cannot remain vulnerable to changes and insecurity. Madam Speaker, let me quote Ram and McRae in their offering of comments on Budget 2025. And I state, open quote, the proliferation of subsidies, grants, and allowances addresses symptoms rather than causes of high living costs. We, on the other side of this house, will not seek to address symptoms. We will bring an end to the diseases itself. We will focus on the alternative government, that is, will focus on structural economic reforms as we need, rather than palliative measures. Madam Speaker, in Guyana, the cost of living has skyrocketed, and we cannot ignore that. That is factual. Many citizens can no longer afford their basic needs, like I did mention earlier. The important problem of inflation and how it directly affects the working class is not addressed in the proposed budget. Simply promising tax break or subsidies is insufficient. We also need to take concrete action to lower the cost of common products. We provide a straightforward solution, a thorough pricing management plan to stop price grouping, particularly for necessities. In order to keep living expenses under control for all for all Guyanese, we also need to set up subsidies for important industries like electricity and transportation. Madam Speaker, I wish to highlight a few things that was done in Region 1 under the APNU AFC while in government. Because we cannot allow ourselves to be led astray and allow the Guyanese people to feel or to believe, as was previously mentioned, that nothing was done under the APNU AFC. The APNU AFC had 5 years in government, while we were told earlier in this debate that the PB had 32 years. So you cannot at no time compare your 32 years to the APNU AFC 5 years in government. Nevertheless, in Region 1, while we are happy that the LCDS transfer are benefiting indigenous communities, We demand that an Indigenous Economic Development Committee be established under the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs, one that will effectively help our indigenous villages to plan, execute, and of course, benefit from these funds. If that is done, I'm sure that the Honorable Minister of Amerindian Affairs will not have all those petitions on her desk by village councillors calling for 2 shows to be recalled, calling for her to intervene in village councils, especially in Region 1. And I could name 2 such villages. Yarakita is one, and 4 Mile is another in Port Kaituma. Madam Speaker, under the APNU AFC, we in Region 1 witnessed a brand new hospital built in Port Kaituma with its own mortuary and a well for water supply. We also saw the Forest Solar Farm in Mabaruma. We also saw the Forest Radio Station in Mabaruma. We also saw the Forest Fire Station in Mabaruma. We also saw the 4 stretches of concrete road across Region 1. We saw an increase in the hours of electricity from 5 hours to 17 hours. And of course, they made it 24 now. Of course, we are happy for that because we started the project. Madam Speaker, the San Jose Bridge in Maruca is another project under the APNUFC. The Bimichi Airstrip in Maruca is another one under the APNUFC. Forest Green Friendly Park in Mabaruma. Establishment of the Township of Mabaruma. First batch of community health workers were trained in 2018 under the APNU AFC government. And you come here to boast about how much were trained recently. Well, we're happy for the training, but you need to tell us under whose stewardship the initiative started. We are happy that you will continue with what was started, but you need to tell us. Madam Speaker, those are just some of the highlights of what we experienced under the APNU FC from 2015 to 2020. And if these are nothing was done, then I'm not sure what are we saying. Madam Speaker, earlier we heard from the Honorable Susan Rodriguez lambasting the APNU AFC members while they were in government for increasing salaries, while she herself and her colleagues are equally enjoying that right now. Madam Speaker, I call on the Honorable Susan Rodriguez and her colleague to bring a motion to this National Assembly and rescind the increase with immediate effect. If you cannot do that, then you don't stand to your words. If you do it, I will congratulate you, myself. Because we keep mentioning this since 2020, 4 years later, it is still being mentioned, but you are enjoying it. Rescind it, and we will congratulate you. Simple. Madam Speaker, the fact that many of our fellow countrymen are trying to make ends meet on the minimum wage is something we cannot ignore any longer. The majority of our workforce is employed in private sector. And although government has made progress in increasing pay for those in the public sector, this has not resulted in improvements for them. A decent minimum wage that takes into account the growing cost of living is long overdue.
Honorable
And
Member, you require 5 minutes to conclude.
Madam Speaker, move that the honourable member be given 5 minutes to conclude this
Granted,
presentation.
please continue.
Thank you, Comrade Speaker. Madam Speaker, it is clear that the government's 2025 budget can do better. Therefore, we offer the following proposal. inflation control measures. We must introduce policies to stabilize the cost of living. These should include price controls on essential goods, subsidies for fuel, transportation, and active management of inflationary measures through fiscal policy and strategic reserve management. Rather than focusing on limited tax cut for the wealthy and businesses, we propose implementing targeted social programs aimed at working class and vulnerable population. This includes direct cash transfer and much more than the 100,000 that is being given presently. Under an alternative government, we will see $1 million being given to every single family in this country. Expanding the cash grant system to cover large proportion of families and introducing progressive tax system that ensure the wealthy pay their shares. We propose a wage increase that is above the rate of inflation, along with an immediate review of salary scales to ensure they reflect the true cost of living in Guyana. In addition, we advocate for better working conditions, training, and professional development for all sectors of the public sector. Of course, which will boost productivity and satisfaction. Strengthening education and healthcare. The budget must prioritize investment in our people, of course. This means substantial increase in funding for education, as is evident in this budget, healthcare, and vocational training programs that will equip, of course, our young people with skills needed for a modern, diversified economy. Madam Speaker, we in the opposition don't have any problem with the allocated funds, especially in education. But we need equity. Indigenous communities, I always speak since 2020 for equitable distribution of our resources. And I will not cease to again call for equitable distribution. I am in the system. I am a teacher for over 20 years and I know the system inside out. Diversification and sustainable growth. We must reduce our self-reliance on oil by diversifying the economy, as I mentioned earlier. Investment must be large in agriculture, technology, and renewable energy, which of course will create long-term sustainable jobs that support every single person in Guyana. The World Economic Forum 2023 emphasized that countries dependent on a single commodity are at significant risk of economic volatility, and Guyana must take steps to mitigate this risk. Madam Speaker, while I close, I'd like to remind the government that every single Guyanese tuned into this debate are listening. They have their own experiences, they have their own opinions, and they, of course, will make their own judgment at the end of these debates. And we call on the government side to use their time wisely to defend their budget, rather than come here to tell us what you told us in 2020. We need not a repeat. In a year where we will have general and regional elections, it is very important that we make ourselves the best choice. Madam Speaker, I trust that I have made my contributions to this budget, and I do hope that each and every one of us listening will ensure that they made a choice at the end of the debates. We cannot and we should not ignore the cries of the working class. And so, Madam Speaker, I thank you for your time, and may God bless each and every one of us.
Thank you, Honorable Member. I now